Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Adopt Open Strategy to Fuel Innovation. I'm Allison Ryder, Senior Project Editor of MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. Our speakers today are Kurt Matzler and Julia Hautz, co-authors of the MIT Press book, Open Strategy. This is the 9th title in the MIT Sloan Management Review MIT Press collaboration, Management on the Cutting Edge. This series presents original research from leaders in academia and industry and provides practical advice to business leaders on how to prepare for the exciting and challenging future that awaits us. Kurt is a professor of strategic management at the University of Innsbruck. He's the academic director of the executive MBA program at MCI in Innsbruck and a partner at international management consulting firm IMP. Julia Hautz is a professor of strategic management at the University of Innsbruck. Julia, Kurt, I will hand things to you to get into your presentation.
Thank you so much, Allison. Good morning, everybody, and good evening in Austria. It's 5 o'clock in the evening. It's a great honor to present some ideas of our book, Open Strategy, that just came out a few weeks ago. The idea for this book originated about 4 years ago, and after 4 years of fascinating research and writing, we are able now to present some ideas of this book today. The first part of the presentation, we will talk about traditional strategy making and why it fails. Then we will present the idea of open strategy. And in the final part of the presentation, we will give you some tips on how to implement open strategy. So let me start with 3 questions I brought. Maybe you think about these questions for a second. So first question, what do you think is the percentage of companies that view digital technologies as disruptive to their business model, in the sense that they make the existing business model obsolete? What's the percentage of companies that fail or stumble when there is a disruption of their industry? And third, what is the percentage of strategic initiatives that fail? Well, there are some quite interesting studies. The first one I'm presenting here from Boston Consulting Group. They surveyed more than 800 executives around the world, asking them the question whether digital technology is disruptive or sustaining in the sense that it improves existing business models. And 1/3 of the companies say digital technology is disruptive in the sense that it makes existing business models obsolete. Second question, Clayton Christensen has written a lot about companies that fail when there is a disruption in their industry, and almost always incumbents fail. This Boston Consulting Group study found that about 2/3 of the companies that face a disruption in their industry either go out of business, are acquired, or stumble and are in great difficulties. Last question, what's the percentage of strategic initiatives that fail? There are many studies about this question, and most of them say between 50 and 90% of strategies fail. They are never implemented or do not lead to success. Now, let me, before I talk about why strategies fail, very briefly describe what the challenges of disruptions are, using a very nice example from Germany. This is Gisbert Rühl. He was CEO of Klöckner Steel Trade, and about 10 years ago, he realized that his business model is very inefficient. He said, this business model is very inefficient because we, as a steel trader, do not know what our customers need in the near future, because we don't have something like predictive selling. And steel producers, on the other side, do not know what we need because we don't know what our customers need. So there's only one way to deal with this inefficiency. It's stockpiling. So Klöckner had steel worth about 1.5 billion euros on stock to react to customer needs. And he said, this is very inefficient. This calls for disruption. So he thought that he had something to do about it. So he decided to travel to Silicon Valley. And he started to talk to many people there, to startuppers, to venture capitalists, to tech companies, asking again and again the same question. What would Silicon Valley do to destroy steel trade? And this is the answer he got. Many of them said, that's very simple. We would build Amazon of steel trade, a digital platform that connects customers and producers. Gisbert realized that this is very disruptive and that he has only two options. Either he starts Amazon of steel trade, or somebody else will. So he came back to Germany. He called his best managers, installed an innovation group, and gave them the mission to develop Amazon of steel trade, this digital platform business model, to realize it did not work for two reasons. First, most managers, and this was a very traditional company, were not able to think radically enough to imagine such a digital business model for their industry. And the second problem was, as soon as they realized what such a digital business model would do, it will kill the existing company, the immune system of the company was activated. And those managers found hundreds of reasons why such a digital business model, such a platform business model would not work in their industry. So Gisbert Rühl decided to go to Berlin. He started a startup there, Klöckner I, that then developed this business model, and it has become a huge success. So what can we learn from this example? First, there is a cognitive barrier for incumbents. They very often are not radical enough in their thinking. There is another barrier, it's the implementation barrier. When disruptive business models cannibalize existing products and services, there is a lot of internal resistance. So companies, when they face disruption, need to take an outside view. And that can dramatically improve their ability to detect the right signals, to see what the changes are, and then it also improves their ability to respond to them. Now, let me briefly talk about other reasons why strategies fail. We call them pathologies of strategy work. The first one is a very interesting phenomenon. It's called isomorphism. Strategy, according to Michael Porter, means being different. That's a very simple but a very powerful definition of a strategy. But it is extremely hard to implement. It's extremely difficult to be different because there is something like institutional isomorphism. And the reason is when new industries emerge, those business models survive that fit the environment, that fit customer needs. And once those business models are successful, other companies start to copy. And that means institutional isomorphism makes companies look increasingly similar. Another challenge is silos and blind spots we see in companies. There is a fascinating book written by Gary Klein. He studied 120 of the biggest inventions and discoveries in history to find that 82% of them originated through cross-fertilization, when people from different disciplines started to talk to each other and exchange ideas. There is another very interesting study done by Oliver Gassmann from Switzerland. He studied more than 300 business model innovations, and he found 90% of all business model innovations are recombinations of existing patterns, very often in other industries. So there is no need to reinvent the wheel, just open up and see what is successful outside your company. A third big problem is mental models or rigid mental models. We have very limited information processing capabilities, so we have to rely on very simplified mental models that represent the world, and they can become very rigid. A very good example is Polaroid in 1992. They were in a very good position to become a big player in digital photography. They held a lot of patents, and they had a very promising prototype in 1992 for a digital camera. But Polaroid, over a decade, has learned that a winning business model is razor blade. Give away the camera practically and make your money with the photos. And when top management had looked at the prototype of the digital camera, they asked the question, where is the film? How can we make money with it? This business model, this mental model of a razor blade was so strong that they couldn't overcome it. And it took them about 4 years because the project, there were so many obstacles. It was so difficult to convince top management about the digital camera that it was introduced 4 years later, when already 40 different brands were in the market. And finally, unpopular strategies. If you do not involve those that have to implement the strategy in strategy making, there will be very little acceptance. They will not understand the strategy. There will be very little commitment. And there is a fascinating effect called the IKEA effect. And there are studies that found that consumers are willing to pay more than 60% more for furniture that they had assembled themselves than for equivalent pre-assembled items. The same applies to strategy. Involve those that have to implement, and there will be much more commitment, attachment to the strategy. We found that 73% of the companies that do open strategy do because they believe that this increases implementation quality of their strategy. Now, let's briefly describe what open strategy is and how that can solve these problems.
Thank you, Kurt. Welcome also from my side. As Kurt has already said, when traditional processes result in strategies that are not able to respond to disruption, that are not creative enough, that are biased, the solution that we suggest is here really to open up strategy. And that is exactly what Barclays did, the UK's third largest bank, when they were moving from a classical branch network to mobile banking. Because back then, the company was really facing immense challenges from digital disruption, but also more and more fintech startups were entering the market. So the organization knew they had to get ahead of change fast. But the leadership team also knew to do that, any strategy not only had to respond to those challenges, but they also had to mobilize the more than 30,000 employees to support those fundamental changes. So what did they do? They decided to combine different open strategy approaches. They started with a number of councils with up to 25 people from very different functional backgrounds, and they brought in very deep operational knowledge and knowledge about the business current state. But at the same time, working groups were realized with frontline employees because they brought in important knowledge about consumer preferences and needs. And they were asked the question, what should Barclays look like in 2020? And this question was open-ended on purpose to avoid a sole focus from the beginning on digitalization. And then those both two perspectives from the councils and the work groups were combined to come up with a first provisional strategic plan, which was held quite simple and clear, because Ashok Vashwani, the CEO of the retail business back then, said a simple strategy understood by all is far better than having a very complex strategy that is only understood by a few. But the company did not stop here. They wanted to fine-tune the strategic plan and develop it even further by including much more frontline employees. So they widened the conversation and held more than 70 town hall meetings over 2 months across the UK to discuss what this plan might mean for the consumer with much more frontline employees. And they said the discussion and the language was quite credible and relevant because frontline employees had already been involved early in the process. And Barclays didn't even stop there. They decided to initiate a 1-week digital strategy jam. This was a moderated online discussion around major themes, and all 30,000 employees were invited to engage in this conversation, because senior leaders then got an idea about which ideas were really worth pursuing, but But even as important, it tremendously increased the understanding and the acceptance of the strategy within the organization, because everybody was talking about it. Again, as Khashwani said, there wasn't one single one of our 30,000 colleagues who would not have known what our strategy was. So this way, the organization strategy came into life in a different way than a speech or a traditional letter from the CEO could have done this. And this allowed Barclays to engage in execution and realization much faster, because only 1 month after the strategy jam, they were able to introduce a new banking platform and a new mobile app, which very quickly became one of the UK's most popular fintech products. And in this very competitive market that was characterized and disrupted by fintech startups, they were able to gain the largest market share among millennials and increase profitability. So openness has really worked for Barclays. But what does it mean? What do we mean with open strategy? It really means actively involving a much larger number and variety of actors outside your top management team in strategy deliberations. And this can be frontline employees, this could be experts, consumers, startups, suppliers, even competitors. So rather than limiting your strategy conversations to the small top management teams, which are homogeneous, they might have experience, but are very similar in background, you can invite many others who view the world really in a different way. And as we have seen with Barclays, these outside perspectives do not necessarily have to come outside of the organization. You can make use of the very diverse pool of knowledge within your company. And we have talked with the founder of a strategy community at Ericsson, and he really got excited about this, because he said, you find knowledge within your company, it's just magic. You find it in places you would never imagine that it's there. But of course, you can also go beyond organizational boundaries and invite people from outside your organization, even from outside your industry. And we will show in examples that sometimes it can also be very helpful to have externals and internals combined. And as we discuss in our book, you have a wide variety of tools available to invite those people into your strategy process. In the toolbox, you can choose from analog formats, workshop formats, as we have seen with Barclay, but of course there are many digital platforms and tools out there, strategy jams, community platforms, contests, even prediction markets. But before you decide on a specific tool or get excited about a specific tool, you have to step back for a second and think really what you want to achieve by opening up. So what is the reason? What question do you want to answer with opening up? Because openness can really help you along 3 core phases of the strategy process. And you have to be clear about this. So do you want to collect many new ideas and identify future trends that might affect your organization or your industry? Or do you want to analyze those ideas and develop very detailed and specific business models already? Or do you want to mobilize your workforce and get them engaged in realizing a new business model? And this might impact, of course, the question that you are asking, and we will now give you different examples on the different phases.
Now, some of the biggest challenges in developing disruptive business models is first detect weak signals, overcome those cognitive barriers I mentioned before, and disrupt yourself. Now there is, imagine you are a producer of hearing aids. Your company is 100 years old, and you start thinking about what digitalization means to your business model. And you start reading, and you come across an article in Fast Magazine that describes a small startup called Doppler in the United States that has developed these earbuds that come with an app on your smartphone. And these are quite interesting because they have artificial intelligence built in, so they can cancel out unwanted background noises. Now, that's nothing special, but they can also amplify the voice of a particular person in the room. So that is a hearing aid functionality. And they also described that they would be able to include real-time language translation in those earbuds. And then you go on and wonder what else those earbuds could do. They talk about building in sensors, so they could track anything. They could count steps, measuring oxygen saturation, heart rate monitoring. They could measure stress and so on. Also voice recognition. So with those earbuds, you can operate your smartphones. There are interfaces with your TV, hi-fi. You can receive messages, 3D printing. So all in all, a very cool product, a highly disruptive product, because this cool product combines the utility of the hearing aid for mild hearing loss, obviously, with the entertainment value of a pair of high-end headphones. Now, what could be the market? Well, it's our non-users. About 80% of those who would benefit from a hearing aid don't have one because of stigmatization. Now, this sounds like a very disruptive product. Now, your challenge as a traditional producer of hearing aids is first, you need to understand what the trends in the markets are, how those technologies evolve over time, how you can combine them in a viable business model, which is difficult enough because none of these technologies here are among your core competences. Now, these are some challenges, and this is an example of a company of how they have overcome these challenges with an open strategy approach. So what they did was they created a strategy team consisting of 24 internals and 12 externals throughout the strategy process. They invited somebody from MIT Media Lab, from Infineon, because they know everything about chips, from IBM Watson, they know everything about artificial intelligence, Intel, Sennheiser, a potential competitor. So the first challenge is see what is going on, understand what the trends are. So internals together with internals worked on a project to identify the most important trends. They identified 61 trends in technology, society, and so on. And many of those the company was not aware of before. Now, next step, the next challenge was to develop some scenarios for the market, for consumers, and for competition. And the challenge here is to overcome those rigid mental models, challenge assumptions. Now, what they have done together, internals with externals, they developed some scenarios based on those trends. One of them, for example, was hearables, like smartphones, would dominate conventional hearing aids in future. Hearables would offer the same functionality for mild to moderate hearing loss that hearing aids once did. And conventional products, they would then become a niche product only for severe hearing loss. Now they had some scenarios. They had overcome their rigid mental models and could understand what could happen. The next challenge was developing disruptive business model. But before they did so, they had to overcome another barrier, which is disruptive business models for a number of reasons are unattractive to incumbents. And there is a very good tip to overcome this unattractiveness: frame them as a risk. Ask yourself, what would be a business model that would totally disrupt your industry? So externals together with internals developed, imagined such business models. They constructed what we call nightmare competitors, business models of competitors that would totally disrupt the business. And that opened up their minds. They developed 22 business models. And then there was a final step, and that was developing your own business model based on the analysis you did before. Externals, again, together with internals. And the challenge here is break free of industry's dominant logic. The recommendation here is use analogies. So what they have done is, based on those nightmare competitor business models, they developed some new business models for this company. One of them could be, for example, analogy smartphone with apps that the company focus is on producing the hardware. They create a platform product like a smartphone that works with apps. Now, the question, for example, could also be, if this is the business model, what could be the profit formula? And here again, use analogies, use outsiders to help find answers. For example, ask the question, how would Nespresso do it? They would use the razor blade pricing model. How would Apple do it? They would use probably a premium product. So with the open strategy approach, this company was able to overcome the most important challenges in developing disruptive business models.
Yes. As we've said, we also conducted a survey among more than 200 European and US strategic leaders, and they told us that yes, they are opening up to get those new ideas and those diverse ideas and radical ideas, but the even larger proportion, as Kurt mentioned, were looking for help for strategy implementation. So they needed support with understanding, commitment, and acceptance of strategies within their organizations. Because if strategies are created at the top and employees are mere passive recipients, it's of course very hard to create this shared commitment and common understanding. So very often employees do not feel very strongly about their organization strategy. They feel left out, and this has severe consequences. And we have seen with Barclays already that opening up can help here. But another company that is very successful in giving its more than 125,000 employees a constant voice and role in strategy deliberations is Telefonica, the Spanish telecom giant. In 2009, a small group of employees started using an employee social network to exchange knowledge and discuss ideas. And soon, even without formal sponsorship, they get thousands of participants. So in 2013, it was decided that senior leaders can use this network to discuss ideas before the executive summit. This was a biannual event that was held traditionally closed doors, and it was even seen kind of mystical in the eyes of employees. In 2015, all employees were allowed to discuss ideas on the network prior to the summit, and in 2018, for the first time, the entire summit was live streamed and everybody could post and discuss what they were seeing. And since then, the open strategy commitment of Telefonica has even intensified. In 2019, the CEO and chairman asked employees on the network what they would do to improve Telefonica, and based on the thousands of ideas that he got, the company started the biggest strategic turnaround in the history. So at Telefonica, strategy is nothing what employees learn about passively. Rather, they are really actively engaging in it, and this was confirmed by Luz Rodrigo Martorell, who is responsible for managing this social network. And she even said it really pays off because you have this much greater strategy knowledge, and people really internalize the strategy. They work on them with real commitment because people feel part of it. And this can be even seen in very high interaction numbers on an ongoing basis in the network and a high sense of belongingness. But one fundamental reason why the open strategy approach is so successful at Telefonica is really the ongoing interaction and tremendous effort of its CEO and chairman, José María Álvarez Payete. He is really constant feedback, comments on the network, is engaging in the debate, is building on the ideas, is realizing the ideas, and is showing the employees not only that he's taking the contribution seriously, but that he is really seeing real value in it. And he says it on the website. He is proud of all this commitment and involvement, and he has read and analyzed all of the posts. And that is really important, because if people do not have the feeling that their contributions are adequately valued and acknowledged, the results are frustration, demotivation, and even lower engagement. So active top management support is really a critical factor for success in any effort to open up your strategy. So to wrap up, let's come to the question, how can it work for you? And if you remember the 3 phases of the strategy process, it might now be a little bit clearer about which questions you can tackle with opening up. But you still have to consider additional aspects of how you configure your open strategy process. First question is, who are the people that have the relevant knowledge to address your questions? Are those internals or externals? We have seen internals can increase diversity of knowledge compared to top management teams, but they still have this relevant knowledge about consumer preferences and insights and knowledge about internal structures and processes that help to evaluate ideas and then, of course, realize ideas. On the other hand, externals do not have this knowledge about your current business, but they can bring in those perspectives that are not limited by prior assumptions and beliefs or social and political pressures that might exist within your organization. They can transfer this knowledge from seemingly unrelated fields and help to cross-fertilize and to identify those radical new ideas that Kurt has talked about. And very often a combination can be helpful. So the next question is, how can you find those people? How can you approach them? How can you select them? And how can you interact with them? And we have seen you can go digital and post an invitation on the web, and everybody there just self-selects into the process based on their own interests and motivations. Then you will get a large crowd usually, and this might be very helpful in idea generation or also execution. On the other hand, you might say, I want to keep in control of selecting specific people and manage this process, which might result in a smaller group of internals and maybe also externals who work in analog workshop formats, for example, on strategy formulation and developing detailed business models. So by going through those different categories in the 3 different phases, you will get very detailed information about which tool is appropriate in your specific situation. But, and that's our last comment, we do want to say that open strategy, it's much more than just a specific tool or a specific set of tools. It's really a fundamental shift in thinking. It's a new management philosophy. And we think that is very nicely summed up in this statement that we got from Luz from Telefonica, who really said the world out there has changed. People have become used to create content, to voice their opinion, and organizations have to adapt to this. They have not adapted at the same pace. They still have to change strategy. They still have to catch up. And we believe this change in strategy can only be based on a strategy approach that is based on the values of transparency, inclusion, and diversity. And before we engage with your questions and in a discussion, we also wanted to ask you to think a little bit of the situation in your organization and what might be the biggest challenge in your situation if you would think to adopt an open strategy approach. We have given you 5 alternatives, and you can just choose the one that you might think might be the biggest challenge. Maybe there are multiple challenges out there, but what would be the biggest obstacle if you want to engage in such an open strategy process? So we are very much looking forward for your answers and also for your questions.
Kurt, Julia, thank you so much. We'll just let this poll run for a couple more seconds as the audience is entering their thoughts, and then we can take a look at that. Here we go. So I have the benefit, hopefully you can see these results, of seeing as the numbers were changing, and they started very heavily skewed toward the top result here to convince top management. At first it was over 50%, so the sample did even out a little bit here. Our audience did have fewer difficulties in that regard, but is this distribution kind of what you expected or surprising?
At the moment, I think we can't see the results. So if you can sum them up for us.
Sure. So to convince top management is the top result, coming in with 39% of respondents. The second is to design the process the right way. That's 23%. Next, very close for the next 2, to handle sensitive information, 17%. To handle and process the ideas, you get 15%, and to find the right participants, 6%.
Yes, I think that is somehow in line with our expectations, because we have seen that really top management, and as we've mentioned this in the presentation, plays a critical role here. So still many senior leaders see strategy as something that is their role, and they might fear a little bit that inviting others into the process is compromising their role, or diminishing their role, or compromising their status and power even within the organization. But we have seen in many examples that that is not the case. So it's very important to note that open strategy, it's not about democracy. So it's not about everyone is going to decide. Senior leaders still have they need to decide. Their role is really to facilitate, to listen, to acknowledge, but in the end, the decisions have to be taken by the top management team. So I think this is something that is very important to note, and which also helps for top management to overcome some of the barriers and hurdles in this regard. I think designing the process, hopefully our book can give some insights. If you do it in a quite systematic way and start with the question, it might be helpful to consider then those questions: who are the people out there, how to approach them, how to interact with them to find and design the process in the right way. Sensitive information is always kind of an issue because it's very often associated opening up with a loss of information.
Well, to be honest, I expected that handling sensitive information would be mentioned more often. It was mentioned only 17% of the time. You know, traditional strategy is a lot about secrecy and involving people that are not traditionally involved in strategy, especially externals, means that you share knowledge with them. And there, of course, is the risk or potential danger of others stealing or profiting from your ideas and knowledge. So in many talks, this is one of big issues, how to handle sensitive information. Companies that do open strategy, however, this is what we found, they have a different attitude to secrecy. Very often, it's more important for them to be fast, to get access to new knowledge, than the risk of losing secrets. For example, in the case I presented of the producer of hearing aids, they shared all the knowledge that was developed throughout the process with all external participants. So every participant could use all knowledge that was created for their own purposes. So they have a different attitude to secrecy. Speed is very often more important than secrecy.
And of course, you can also help with the design of the process, because if you are mainly interested in the first phase, where you just want to collect a broad number of ideas and get insights into trends, you might not necessarily have to share so much information from inside the company. It might even be hindering very creative and disruptive ideas. So it also depends on the phase and the stage. And in the last stage, when implementation is at the key, you might be just addressing internal people and employees. So again, sensitive information might not be that of an issue. In the formulation stage, it might be because you go into this very detailed business models, and here very often companies work with the small workshop groups and then of course use NDAs. And what was very interesting in our research project was also that we found that even the most secretive companies from the military background, like the US Navy, the US intelligence community, they were very successfully applying open strategy approaches. And those are not necessarily the organizations that you would associate with openness and transparency, rather than with strict secrecy. So that was really interesting to see that there is a way to design the process to benefit from openness without sacrificing information.
Maybe one more thing regarding designing the process and handling ideas. This must be a well-managed process, and it's not so easy to manage it very well. We came across a very interesting example of a German company. They produced an Afri-Cola, which was a popular brand in Germany, and a couple of years ago they decided to use a new recipe for their cola, and many consumers did not agree. So there were 1,700 consumers that came together and decided that they will produce the old recipe and market the old recipe. And their organizational form was a community, and everyone had a say in the strategy process. And this led to nowhere. It was chaotic. So you have to have a very clear process, well managed. You have to clarify decision rights. So it's not a cure for all ills.
We have so many questions. So thank you both for your talk, for expanding on those results. I think you've touched on a lot of the themes that came up in our questions just by speaking to those 5 points. That's probably part of your design. Well done there. I did want to talk about leadership. There have been a lot of questions about that coming in kind of on two sides. So I guess on the first side, imagine that you are a leader and you are exposed to this framework and you think, this is great, I do want to do this. How would you start to think about getting started? Of course, it's aligning a broader management team around this effort, but do you have any practical steps for kind of, we've never operated in this way, but we want to try?
So maybe the very first step, before even thinking about questions and tools and designs, would even assess your own individual openness. Because when we were talking to leaders, of course, everybody said, yes, I'm open-minded. Of course, I value diversity. But if you then go on and talk to people and confront them maybe with situations which are quite unpredictable, which has serendipity, where they have to assess the value of ideas which have at the first sight nothing to do with their industry, and assess the value of people who come from very, very distant fields, they become a little bit hesitant. So what we did in the book is to post several questions that you can answer, and based on the answers you can see how open-minded you yourself at an individual level are. And that's very important because in our studies we found that not only you are then more likely, of course, to adopt open strategy, but you are also much more likely to generate profits out of it. There was a positive impact of individual open-mindedness on the profits that can be generated from open strategy approaches. So it's really very important to believe in this approach, and that's why we say it's a mindset shift. It's not only applying a tool once, it's a long-lasting change in how you approach strategy work.
It's a lot about mindset, and if you don't have that open mindset, our recommendation is start with small steps and open up gradually. And you also have to develop your culture in the organization, because this is not only a change of mindset, it's also a change of culture. And there are many simple things you can do to change your own mindset to become more open, because that is a precondition for success of open strategy. One recommendation we give, and these are very simple recommendations, but they are very effective. One recommendation we give is start talking to frontline employees more often, because they have a lot of operational knowledge you probably need for your strategy. Very often strategy is made at the top. There is little communication with frontline employees, and leaders do not really understand what works and what does not work. G, for example, they started with a very bold digitalization strategy, IoT, and they developed a lot of business models and tried to digitalize their factories with very sophisticated approaches with tablets and so on, and did not know that in many of their factories there was no wireless. So obviously there was no communication with their frontline employees. And also start talking to strangers, because they have very different backgrounds, and they can very often ask very challenging questions and challenge your assumptions. There is a fascinating study by Karim Lakhani from Harvard Business School who studied, we can learn a lot, by the way, from open innovation. And he studied those open innovation platforms, those idea contests, and one of the contests platforms he studied was Innocentive, where companies, when they have technological problems, can post a problem to find anywhere in the world somebody who can solve the problem. And if you're able to solve it, you get a fee. And Karim wanted to know who the winners of those contests are. And what he found was fascinating. The probability to win such an idea contest increases with the solver's fields of expertise, with the distance of the solver's field of expertise to the problem field. In other words, the less we know, the more likely it is that we win such a contest. And more than 70% of the solutions were already known. So talk to frontline employees, talk to strangers. These are some first steps that make you more open, and you will recognize the value of being open.
It reminded me of so many things as you were just speaking, but I think about, there's just an element of stepping back a little bit, that some of these things seem very simple and straightforward. And what I was thinking back to was in a prior life, many years ago, working in a food service restaurant, a very famous multinational one. And a bunch of folks came in to redesign the store experience. And they all came in with their clipboards, and they're taking notes, and they're walking around doing everything. Did they stop for a minute to ask any of us about anything? They're saying, oh, the blender will go here, and this will go here. And we're overhearing this and saying, wait, this is going to be terrible, because then I'm going to bump into you while you're at this station. And, and just, you would think that those things would be documented in a way that those teams would know, but they're not necessarily. And if you just take the very logical step back of, hey, I just want to understand how this works for you, or what do you think about that? I think that's a great first step, and it suggests to me that you're looking for leaders who are inquisitive in a way and able to just kind of think a little bit more curiously, I guess I would say. And it leads me to my next question, or an audience question rather, that they were asking, well, what characteristics of leaders are kind of primed for this type of strategy setting? So do you have any specific kind of archetype or personas in mind of qualities, I guess I would say, of leaders who would kind of naturally lean into this and excel at this type of framework?
I think those might be those type of leaders who really engage in openness throughout the entire organization. I mean, one great example is Jim Whitehurst from IBM. So he really lived openness throughout all organizations that he was active, and he really put openness into the DNA of organizations. I think that's very important, to be able to value the diversity of perspectives and maybe untraditional backgrounds, people that do not have the traditional career path maybe, and also have a mindset which, if somebody comes with a crazy idea, that you do not say, okay, good idea, but it won't work in our case, but say, okay, good idea, and let's see how we can make this happen. So that's the kind of mindset that might be needed with open strategy. And as you've mentioned, the good thing is it's not necessarily rocket science. So also smaller organizations can do this. They can take this step back. They can maybe do a small workshop format or use existing network solutions within their organization. So it's not something that can be only done in very large organizations, or that needs a lot of resources. It can start small, as you have mentioned.
Maybe another perspective, of course, leadership is important, but we found some examples that were quite interesting because we could see that with this open approach, doing open strategy workshops with outsiders, those outsiders that were invited could amplify critical voices within the company. To give you an example, we had a steel producer here in Austria, and they did an open strategy workshop, a nightmare competitor workshop to understand what could be disruptive new business models in steel production. And they had a workshop, And there were some internals that said it could be hydrogen, CO2-free steel production. That could be a game changer, but they were not heard by top management. So they did an open strategy workshop, and some externals were invited, and they said, well, CO2-free steel production, that is a big issue, and hydrogen could be the solution. And there was a lot of discussion, and some of the internals ridiculed those externals until one of them banged on the table and said, well, you know, if CO2-free steel production is possible based on hydrogen in future, and you don't do it, you will be killed. And then somebody said, well, it's not possible technically. And then he said, well, there are some patents already there. Here are the patents. So he could amplify the internal voices, and then the top management, because those externals had a credibility, the top management started to listen it, and then they decided to produce the biggest pilot plant in the world to produce hydrogen for CO2-free steel production. So it can be also a tool to amplify internal voices and convince top management of those disruptive ideas.
You're touching on where I wanted to take the question next, which was sort of the flip side of you have this ambitious leader who's ready to do this and wants to know how to get started, to what if I'm someone in an organization, I really like this idea, but I'm not sure my leadership would buy in. How do you go about some of that mindset shift when you're managing up to try to inspire folks at the top to consider this type of approach? Do you have any further thoughts on that?
Well, if you're not able at all to convince top leaders, I would say open strategy is not the right approach. Unless you start with very, very small steps and quick wins, do some little projects where you know this will work, and then you might be able to convince top management. Otherwise, I would not touch it.
I would definitely agree, and I would always say that it's good to start small, because in all the examples, also for example Telefonica, they also didn't start with the big network and by broadcasting everything in the first year. It really grew. You have to experiment. You have to realize what works for you in your specific situation. But in the long run, I think without support from top management, it's just very difficult and it won't work in the long run. But, and that's the good thing, top management can be convinced if you can show them it really works. And it works. If it's designed in a good way, there are benefits in there, and that's the easiest way to convince top management usually.
Start small is the theme of the day, and I like that. I'll take that back to my desk and baby steps toward everything. Curious about, we have a very tech-focused, tech-interested audience, and one question about how can we think about analytics, AI, machine learning as inputs to some of this decision-making? Did you look at all at any organizations that are thinking about using different technologies to inform some of this ideation or implementation, and what might that look like?
This is a very good question. Of course, there's a lot going on in AI, also to use it for strategic decisions. But we are talking a lot about disruptive innovations, and that means these are new combinations of ideas, these are new business models, and AI requires a lot of past data. And it's very difficult to use AI for such completely new things where there is no experience in the past. So I think there are the limitations of AI when it is about disruptive business model innovation or disruptive strategies.
And this is exactly where we have seen the biggest value of openness, because we do not say, okay, in the future, openness, it's the default and traditional strategy processes will die. We still see value of traditional strategy processes if you want to fine-tune your core business in a quite stable market. But what we have seen, if organizations are facing this threat of disruptions and of fundamental changes, this openness can really help you to see those trends coming, to react to those trends, and to do it in a fast way. So in these situations, the open approach is just a very valuable one.
Got it. No, that makes a lot of sense. I want to switch gears to demographics a little bit, thinking about different types of organizations. So you gave the Barclays model, really strong for B2C companies, and had an audience member asking, well, if you're talking about B2B and specifically large organizations, and I think implicit in this is probably legacy, not digital first organizations, if only a small percentage of folks there have these boundary spanning roles or customer facing roles and access to more of that kind of open mindset, how might you recommend they approach this type of process?
I think, as we have said, it's always good to start in a small way and think, okay, who might be the people that could help you? And you do not necessarily have to go very broad and invite a first large crowd already in there, but start and think and read and ask people who might be the ones that I can ask, and go snowballing and have this little group of internals and externals, and try to have at least the balance with the same number of internals and externals, and try to find them. And of course, you can use I don't know, people who can help you to find those people. I have even seen organizations that made little contests about to select the people that can then engage in such initiatives, to find those small groups just as a start. And here it might be very helpful to go outside the organizations and find some first few experts to start off. And then the additional larger efforts, as in the case of Barclays, can come later on.
Makes sense. Thank you. As we get a little tactical and think about maybe we're ready to host a forum or a discussion group with a large group of constituents, do you have any practical suggestions for how to facilitate that type of work? I guess the question gets at kind of, if you bring in formal resources, like, is it better to have an internal moderator for these types of discussions or someone external? And so then that gets me to, you're kind of formalizing another layer of this by maybe bringing in consultants of some sort to facilitate these discussions. Have you seen that employed? Do you recommend it, recommend against it? What do you think about that?
This is a very good question. One of the observations we have made, if you do an open strategy workshops with internals and externals, have an equal number of internals and externals. Otherwise, internals will overrule externals and the other way around. So having an equal number is very important. And second, I would use an external facilitator who is not involved in those topics. It's much easier for them to handle, and there can be very tough discussions, to handle tough discussions.
Mm-hmm. I think that's especially the case in those face-to-face settings. In the digital setting, it might depend a little bit on the experience that the company already has with such a software. I mean, there are different platform providers, and very often a company has already used a solution for different purposes. As it was the case at Telefonica, it was merely a knowledge sharing network and a way to communicate, and not necessarily used for strategic purposes, but it evolved over time. So here it might really depend on what is the experience that you have in your organizations with different setups. Maybe you have done this already in the area of innovation and you are familiar with specific platforms that you can then also use or transfer to questions related to broader strategic questions. So I think that's really something that you have to assess on your own. If you do not have any experience with this, it might be helpful to see what providers of platforms are out there, and if they also give you a hand in moderating it. But, and that's very important, it needs to be managed and moderated somehow. Somebody has to be in charge of taking care that people get acknowledged, that they get know what happens with their contribution. So the worst thing that could happen with a digital solution is that people are submitting ideas and then never realize what happened with those ideas. They don't get any feedback or any information back. So that's very important, and that of course needs resources and time, and therefore it needs to be handled somehow. And in the case of Telefonica, we have seen there's a big value if this is handled internally and from the top of the organization, because it increases this and amplifies the effect.
Right, and so to the point, come back to starting small and thinking about maybe there's a bit of an analog start to this, and as you think about introducing digital tools and cataloging in those ways, of course there's inherent complexity, but there are also, I'm sure, more insights to mine and access to that data in a more structured way. So I think lots of food for thought. I would certainly encourage people to pick up a copy of the book. It has a lot of very actionable insights and diagrams and frameworks that I think can help you start to think about this, because we have many more questions we unfortunately don't have time to get to. This is all the time we have today. So Julia, Kurt, I do want to thank you both for sharing these fantastic insights, getting us really thinking about leadership, strategy setting, innovation, all of this on a Tuesday morning, in our case, evening for some of us. Thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.